Welcome, everyone. Today is November 23rd, and we are doing Revelstoke History 101 for Revelstoke Welcome Week. This is an opportunity for us the community, to welcome people who have recently moved to Revelstoke or who are coming here for the winter season. And Revelstoke History 101 is just a way to give a sort of capsule history of the community, sort of some of the basics of the history of Revelstoke. Well, there we go. So we need to start by acknowledging that we are on the traditional territory of Indigenous nations. We know that the Sinixt Nation lived in this area. They had village sites. They had did their seasonal rounds, hunting and fishing. We also know that this land is acknowledged by the Secwepemc Nation, who also spend a lot of time here and are very connected with the Sinixt. They also hunted and fished here and had sites in this region. We also know that the Tanaha and the Silks have very strong ties to this region. We do have an exhibit in the museum about the Sinixt. It's a complicated story. And we also have some other YouTube videos specifically about the history of the Sinixt. And I encourage you to watch those and become a bit more aware of the history of the Sinixt in this region. The short history is that they lived on the Columbia River and its tributaries for centuries, and that they had 80% of their land base in what's now Canada and 20% in the United States. And once there was settlement and fur trade and the borders were established, most of the Sinixt were sort of pushed south and included in a reservation, in a Colville Reservation. And after that, it became increasingly difficult for them to access their territory in Canada. Their requests for appropriate land reserves were not taken into account. And by 1956, there were very few Sinixt people still living in this region. And they were declared extinct as a nation for purposes of the Indian Act by the Government of Canada. And just in recent years, they've actually made some gains in having a Supreme Court case that recognized their traditional rights in this area. This photograph shows a family in a sturgeon nose canoe. So it's on the Arrow Lakes. It could also have been on the Kootenay Lakes. We're not entirely sure of the provenance of the photograph, but they were known for their sturgeon nose canoes, which was an unusual design shared by the Tanaha people as well. And but there's, we're uncovering more and more history of them. When I first started working here in the 1980s, we really didn't tell their story at all. It was the sort of the history that we told was that they weren't really here, that they came through, that the Indigenous people came through, but they didn't have settlements. We now know that's not true, and we're trying to work with the nations and tell their stories. And this is an ongoing story that we'll continue to share and shape as we make relationships and learn more. The first white explorer in the area was David Thompson and his group of explorers. He was a geographer and map maker employed by the Northwest Company, fur trading company. And over a period of several years, he explored and mapped the entire Columbia River. In 1811, he went over the Athabasca Pass from Jasper to the top of the big bend of the Columbia River. So the Columbia River starts near Canal Flats and through Columbia Lake, and travels north past what's now Golden, travels north another almost 100 miles, takes a big bend, and then comes down on this side of the Selkirks, and down about 24 miles south of here, it widens into two long narrow lakes called the Upper and Lower Arrow Lakes, and then narrows again at Castlegar and continues into the States and eventually comes out at Oregon. And so David Thompson mapped the entire river. He traveled the entire river and mapped it, and was the first one to do so. And that opened up the fur trade on the Columbia River. The fur trade kind of petered out by the 1850s, but some of the later people who were coming through in there were making discoveries of gold on the tributaries into the Columbia north of here, particularly Gold Stream, McCulloch Creek, Carnes Creek, Downey Creek, and those creeks were mostly named after some of the early miners and prospectors that were making these gold discoveries. And there was, as a result of that, it created a gold rush in the 1860s. It was, it doesn't get as much publicity as the Barkerville and the Yukon gold rushes, but it was significant just the same. There was a period of 2 years, about 1865 to 1866, when there were thousands of people who came into the area, and there was the estimate that there was $3 million worth of gold that was declared at that time, probably even more undeclared. And of course, that's $3 million in 1860s dollars. So it was quite significant in terms of the amount. But it was difficult to get into. You either had to come over the mountains from the Shuswap Lake to the Columbia River and then across the river, or you had to come up the river from the United States. So there was a lot of miners that were coming up from Washington State, and there was actually even a steamboat that was built to bring some of the miners up into the region. But because of how difficult it was to get in here and to get out significant amounts of ore, it really petered out after a couple of years. But there really was mining after that time. Once Revelstoke was established and people were coming into this region, there was mines established all throughout the area, in the Illecillewaet area, east of here in the Big Bend, and south into what's known as the Lardo area around Trout Lake. And so it's, and there's still active mining claims in the region. So it's still not as big a part of the economy as it once was, but still one of the industries that shaped this region. And even in that time, there was nobody other than the original Indigenous settlement on the West Bank in the Big Eddy area of the Sinaiaks people. There weren't any settlers who really established themselves here in Revelstoke until 1885. And it was really the coming of the Canadian Pacific Railway that created the town site that became our community. So when people ask, why is Revelstoke here? It's really because of the railway. Of course, it took them a long time to determine the route for the railway, and a lot of survey work and exploration, but they finally decided on the Rogers Pass route, which was named after Major A.B. Rogers, who surveyed the pass, and then through the Eagle Pass west of here onto to Vancouver. It was the Canadian Pacific Railway Company that was in charge of construction, but they were very much involved with the Canadian government. The government had a real strong stake in having the Trans-Canada Railway built because it was part of the terms of Confederation of British Columbia entering the Confederation. So it was really important that the railway get built, and it took many, many years. But finally it was completed just west of Revelstoke at Craigellachie on November 7th, 1885. And if you watch my last brown bag history talk on our YouTube channel, I was talking about the boy that shows up there, Edward Mallandane, who looks about 12, but was actually 18 at the time and had been working in the area. That's another great story. So at the time that the railway was being built, that's really what established the community here. And it was originally called Farwell. And that was, Farwell was Albert Stanhope Farwell, who was a provincial surveyor. And he knew that the railway was going to go through here. He'd actually been involved in some of the survey work for the railway. But he also knew that once the CPR filed their full survey plan, that this land would be under their control as part of the Railway Belt Act, which is an agreement between the Dominion or federal government and the provincial government, whereby the government of Canada was taking over lands along the railway belt, and then in most cases granting that to the CPR. But Farwell, because he had kind of an insider knowledge, he applied for a provincial grant in this area before the survey plan was filed. So he was trying to do an end run around the CPR and get control of the land here. And he thought he would make a lot of money selling his land to the CPR. It's also a very long, complicated story. But the upshot of it was that the CPR refused to deal with Farwell. And if Farwell had gotten his way, he also owned the land that's now known as Columbia Park. So he most likely would have sold land where the A&W and the McDonald's is now to the railway for their station and yards. But instead of dealing with him, they moved outside of his grant and established their station just the other side of Mckenzie Avenue, where it is now. And that was outside of Farwell's grant, so there was nothing he could do about that. But he'd already established this town site there, and a lot of the original businesses had established down there. But once the railway station established outside of his land, most of the businesses were not happy about having to pay additional shipping to get their goods shipped from the station down to their businesses, even though it was only just over a mile. So the businesses started eventually moving up to this part of town, close to the station. And that's why our downtown is where it is now. It was completely shaped because of that land dispute. Otherwise, we'd all be going down to our businesses down on Front Street. But Front Street eventually sort of, it was reasonably well established for several years. But by the 1920s, there were really no businesses left on Front Street, only a couple of the old hotels, and they were finally torn down. So it really shaped how the town developed. But for a while, there were actually two town sites. And even though the name of the community was changed to Revelstoke, they still referred to Farwell as Farwell or Lower Town, and this is Upper Town. For a while, there were two fire departments, there were two post offices. They even had like rival sports clubs that have like two toboggan runs, two tennis clubs. So it really did split the community for a while. But you can see in this photograph that was probably taken around 1908. It's probably a funeral procession on Front Street. But there's some substantial buildings there. There's a big hotel at the end of the street, several general stores. This was also the somewhat seedier part of town, so it had started out as a real sort of frontier town during the railway construction. So there were also a number of saloons and brothels on Front Street as well, and it kind of retained that character. There was also a Chinatown on Front Street, but then once the town site or the business area moved, there was also a second town Chinese section around the corner from where the bowling alley is now. So this was one of that big hotel that you can see in the end of the last picture we looked at. It was the Central Hotel owned by the Abrahamson brothers. They came to Revelstoke in 1885 during railway construction. They'd been following construction across the country and had been establishing little boarding houses and restaurants as they went. So once they got here, they established their business. And their first hotel was a big tent with wood put along the sides of it for the winter to try to keep it a bit warmer. And then they expanded a couple of times in 1897 and again in 1908. But a lot of hotels were making their money out off of their bar. And once Prohibition was brought into effect in British Columbia in about 1917, it kind of closed down a lot of the big hotels that really relied on their liquor business. So they were closed by about 1918, and finally it was torn down. Revelstoke, as I said, was connected by the railway, but it really relied also on the northwest transportation link into the Kootenays by steamboats. So the Columbia River was a really important link in the transportation chain. These were two boats that were built at Revelstoke for use on the Columbia River and the Arrow Lakes, and they would go down as far as where Castlegar is now and then connect up with other railways into the United States and into Nelson. So it really connected this whole region. And eventually the Canadian Pacific Railway built a branch line between Revelstoke and the former community of Arrowhead, which is 24 miles south, near where across from where the Shelter Bay Ferry is now. And then the CPR had a fleet of steamboats that would operate from Arrowhead down to Castlegar. So it opened up that whole north-south traffic along the river as well. This Steamboat Landing would be just at the north or south end of Front Street in the 1890s. And at the very right side of the photograph, you can see a little structure there. That was actually a smelter, which was just beyond where the community center is now. It's land that was that sloughed into the river, and the smelter fell into the river. But it was very short-lived. Smelter operated here for a short time in 1891. So this is who we're named after, Edward Bering. He was first Lord Revelstoke and manager of the Bering's Bank in England. The Canadian Pacific Railway, by 1885, during the tail end of their construction, they were practically bankrupt, and they were able to get a large issue of stock issued by the government of Canada, and they were able to sell that stock. The Bering's Bank in England bought enough of the stock to keep the company afloat and allow them to complete the railway. So they wanted to honor him, and the officials of the Canadian Pacific Railway Company wrote to the Post Office Department of Canada asking them to change the name of this community from Farwell to Revelstoke. And they were saying, well, Farwell was really nothing at all. He was just a squatter, and the name amounted to nothing. So because the CPR had that much financial clout, they were able to make that change, and were now named after a British lord who never set foot here. Though his great-great-grandson did come for a visit in 2009. We had a lot of fun with him. So because of the town site dispute, and it actually was caught up in the court for quite a few years, people weren't able to get clear title to their land. A lot of the banks didn't want to establish here because of that. And because of that uncertainty, the city wasn't able to incorporate until 1899, when they were finally able to get agreements from the provincial government for protection of the riverbank, which was starting to erode away. So this was our first council in 1899. The first, I show this picture to school classes all the time and ask them what they notice. And of course, the first thing they notice is the rather impressive facial hair that they all have. And they notice that they're all very formally dressed. They're all wearing the suits and ties. And after a while, they usually realize that they're also all men. And so that gives me an opportunity to talk about how women couldn't vote in elections, and they certainly couldn't hold office. The women didn't get the vote in British Columbia until 1917, and then in other parts of the country after that. Really, it was another one of the offshoots of the First World War, that women finally getting the vote. Another thing that we discuss with the classes, once they've noticed that it's all men, we talk about where these men would have come from and realize that they were all from originally, either them or their families were originally from Great Britain. So there's maybe a couple of Irish names there, a couple of Scottish and English names, but there was, even though there was a good portion of the community at that time that was, there were Chinese people living here, there were Italians, Ukrainians started to come mostly a little bit after that, a lot of Scandinavians, but that the city council is very white male Anglo-Saxon. And that very typical of Western communities. Revelstoke in 1899, people wonder why we're a city when we're so small. But in 1899, and really continuing up until after World War I, Revelstoke was one of the largest cities in the interior of British Columbia. Of course, Vancouver and Victoria were the two large cities, and New Westminster. But outside of the coast and the island, there was Revelstoke, Nelson, and Kamloops were the large interior centers. Kelowna was a small farming center, same with Salmon Arm and Vernon. But because of Revelstoke's importance as a railway center, it was one of the major centers in the interior. Now, this is one of my favorite pictures in our collection. It's Mckenzie Avenue in 1898. One of the first things you notice is that there's no trees on Mount Revelstoke, but there'd been a fire on the mountain probably in the early 1890s. I do have record of a fire in 1892 that was on the mountain. That could have been the one that took down all the timber on the mountain. But this was sort of in the middle of that process of the move from Front Street to Mckenzie. And Mckenzie Avenue is just starting to build up. You can see a spire in this photograph to the left of the center, and that's the Catholic Church, which is where the Royal Bank is now. It was built there in 1893. It was moved up to Mckenzie and Fifth. Says on my slide 1899, it was actually 1900 it was moved up. And they moved buildings here all the time, especially a lot of when people were relocating their stores from Front Street up to Mckenzie. If they had a decent building, they just moved it. At that time, there were also buildings along the road leading up to the station, and just starting to build up on Mckenzie. The building that you see on that side of the road, the last building is about where the Big Bend Cafe is now, next to the CIBC. So they're just starting to, you can see big piles of dirt. They're just starting to expand Mckenzie at that time. And then the interesting thing is to look from that photo to this photo, which was only about 12 to 15 years difference. And this is fairly recognizable as Revelstoke. The few buildings that are no longer there, on the right side, there's the Imperial Bank, which was built there in 1904. And that was torn down in the 1960s to build what I call the ugly yellow box, which is now the CIBC. There wasn't a real great appreciation for heritage buildings at that time. But there are recognizable buildings. There's the Bank of Canadian Bank of Commerce, which is now Micah Heli-Skiing, the building on the corner, which is where there's some Revy Outdoors and Conversations there, and the clinic in the upper floor. Of course, that noticeable building on the corner on the right side there with the big white pillars, that building is still there. It was built in 1910 as the Molsons Bank. And if the name Molson sounds familiar, it's because it was the same family that has the brewery company. They actually had a bank from the 1850s to the 1920s when it was taken over by the Bank of Montreal. So that's really recognizable Revelstoke. So it's amazing how quickly the town built up. One of the other things to note, it's a little hard to see in this photo, but there are buildings built up all the way to Victoria Road on both sides. So where the parking lots are on either side of the bandstand now, there were buildings right to the corner. But there were fires there. On the one side, it was 1916. On the other side, it was 1914. So a lot of those buildings on the end burnt down. And Revelstoke had been in a real boom up until then, but I think partly due to World War I and just economic pressures, those buildings were never rebuilt. So that's why we have the parking lots on either side. And of course, the Grizzly Plaza that we now know and that we've now have has been there since 1987. It was built as part of a downtown revitalization project and has become a really great community gathering spot. And of course, the railway is still, major employer. For years, it was the major employer in town. It employed the majority of the population in various jobs, both in what's known as the running trades, actually running the trains, as well as maintenance, dispatching, all sorts of other jobs. In this photograph, you can see behind the original station, there's a big building that was a hotel that was built by the CPR there in 1897 and was there until the 1920s when it was torn down. So you can see quite a big operation there at that time. Of course, we're known for our snow, the corner of First and Mckenzie in February 1909. And there were only a few people in town with cars at that time, and they'd park them for the winter. You certainly weren't going to drive your car around. They'd have enough room for maybe a horse and cart to get through in pedestrian traffic, and that was about it. And there's the city snowplow around 1915. This one, it's either they didn't have as much snow or they're getting a little bit better at plowing the streets. But we certainly have lots of epic snowfall photographs in our collection. Revelstoke has promoted tourism since the early 1900s. In 1912, they had a little contest to come up with a slogan. And the one they chose was the capital of Canada's Alps. And we're really sort of promoting that sort of mountain history and our mountain scenery in their advertising. And they actually created a lighted banner across Mckenzie Avenue. So this is from about 1912, 1913. This is where the Royal Bank is now. It was the C.B. Hume and Company store. They had an earlier store in the area across the tracks, and then they bought the property where the Catholic Church had been located. The church was moved, and then they built their new store. And by 1910, it was the largest department store in the interior of British Columbia, and it was the first building in the interior to have an elevator as well. It had an elevator from the top floor to their basement, and they had several departments in there. The store was actually still in operation up until the 1930s. Then it was taken over by the local co-op store and then by the Royal Bank, who completely covered the exterior. You couldn't see a single brick. But the original building, most of it burned down in the 1960s, so that the building that's there now was rebuilt. This was their grocery department. There's some really lovely display of cups and saucers and chinaware on the one side as well. So a pretty impressive looking little store. This is First Street West. So this would be just a block up at the corner of Campbell and First. The big brick building is what's now Style Trend clothing store. And you can see a railway crossing sign there, because there was actually a branch line built in the 1880s from the main line to what was the original smelter, and then also went down to the riverbank to close to where the boat launch is now as a steamboat dock. And that branch line was there until 1971 when they finally took it up. There'd been warehouses and coal sheds along there for years, but it finally came out, and that's why Campbell Avenue is so wide and why it's a divided boulevard, because it used to have a railway track on it. The building on the right side there was a hotel that had been built there in 1900, and it was known as the Climax Hotel, and it was probably every bit as seedy as you might imagine. It was known for a practice called rolling, where the proprietors would, if they saw somebody flashing a fair amount of money, they'd ply them with liquor, and then they'd arrange for somebody to pick him up in a horse and cart, and they'd take him to the riverbank and take his money and dump him. So that they were cited by the city a few times for doing that. But the building burned down in 1916. And you can see also another sign that says beer. That's where Pam's Kitchen restaurant is now. And that was another hotel that was there until it burned down in the 1930s. Here's Mckenzie Avenue around 1940. You can see the current City Hall is there. It was built in 1939, replacing an earlier frame building. And Manning's, Manning's was built there in 1913 as a soda fountain, cafe, and candy shop. They had a full factory in the basement there. We've got an exhibit in the museum about Manning's, and have lots of their candy molds. Lots of people still remember Manning's chocolates, but the Kwong family purchased it in 1955 and turned it into a Chinese restaurant. And it's been a Chinese restaurant ever since, even though they've retained the name Manning's. And it's had several different owners since then. It's a nice picture of Mckenzie Avenue too. This is Mckenzie Avenue in 1962. And you can see the sign for the Roxy. The Roxy started out as Lawrence Hardware that was built on that location in 1905, big brick building. And then in 1938, it was turned into a theater, originally called the Avali, but it's been known as the Roxy since 1959. So it's really a downtown institution for the community. And luckily, they've been able to reopen recently. The forestry has always been a really big part of the economy of Revelstoke, right from the early days. Of course, there were sawmills here there was portable sawmills that moved throughout the construction zone during railway construction time. And then there were mills established in the community, but in the 1880s. This sawmill here was a big one that was established in Big Eddy, close to where or just beyond where the truck stop is now, the other side of the Trans-Canada Highway Bridge. So the forestry is still a big part of the economy. What's now Downey Sawmills has been in operation since the 1940s. And they weathered, a few downturns in the forest industry, but are still operating. Prior to the construction of the Hugh Keenleyside Dam at Castlegar in the 1960s, there were about 200 farms between Revelstoke and Arrowhead, including a large Ukrainian community at the base of Mount Cartier. So people coming into town now, it goes south of the airport and go on to what we call the flats. And a lot of people don't realize that the flats was actually, really fertile farmland, and that there were many families living there between there and what's now used to be the 12-mile ferry going across. So, and then down into the community of Arrowhead, which is really, it was completely abandoned, or people were bought out when they were building the dam. So we actually have an exhibit in the museum called Stories Beneath the Surface. It really talks about what happened with the construction of the dam. And that dam created the reservoir all the way up to Revelstoke, even though the the dam is close to 150 miles south of here, created this huge reservoir. And all in all, there was probably about 2,000 people who were displaced between here and Castlegar because of the construction of the dam. So it changed a lot of this whole landscape. And sometimes people still think that the water fluctuations are because of the Revelstoke Dam, which is north of us, but it's because of this dam built more than 50 years ago and 150 miles away. It had that major impact on our landscape and on the community. This is a map and we've got this copy of this in the exhibit as well, showing some of the farm settlements south of Revelstoke. And you can see there's all those dots in there, and those are representing the farms. So most of the farmland is now below the maximum reservoir level, so people can no longer live down there. And so talked about Revelstoke being really important as a transportation center, and that was true when train travel was really the only way to get across the country. It was train traffic and river steamboat traffic. But once roads started being built throughout the province, Revelstoke really got left behind. The first road between here and Sycamoose and connecting Revelstoke with the west didn't open until the 1920s. And there was no road link between Revelstoke and Golden until 1940. They'd started the road in the 20s, but it took a long, long time to build, partly because of the Great Depression. So if you had managed to drive here from Vancouver and wanted to continue on, the only way to get your car from here to Golden was to put it on the train and then go on the train to Golden and get off and continue driving on from there. So finally in 1940, they completed the Big Bend Highway, but it was following the bend of the river and sort of a long, long way around. You can see this is showing the actual route of the highway, and the line through there shows the rail line, and that's basically where the Rogers Pass is now. So you can see the difference in length. It was a dirt road, never paved, and they had to close it most winters because they weren't able to plow it and keep it open. So that really isolated Revelstoke. Even though, as I say, there was a road, but it still wasn't easily accessed, or it still wasn't, still kind of isolated Revelstoke. And it wasn't until 1962 that the current Trans-Canada Highway was built. And that's really what opened this area up to road transportation. And they could finally keep it open year round with occasional stoppages for avalanches. And the avalanche program has been operating since before they opened the highway. That was a big project. We talk about that in our exhibit, Land of Thundering Snow, which is both exhibit here, and we have an online version of that at landofthunderingsnow.ca. One thing that I always tell people that are moving to town is that if somebody tells you that they were born in Save-On Foods, it's because that's where the original hospital was. There was an earlier wooden version of this hospital, but they rebuilt it as a brick building in 1913. So anybody who was born here before 1970 would have been born in that hospital. And also another tip for locals, if people talk about Coopers, they mean Save on Foods, because it was Coopers was sort of a regional chain, and this was a Cooper's store for many years. So not if you're being confused by people talking about Coopers, they mean Save on Foods. But that was our beautiful brick hospital. And the current hospital was opened in December of 1970. And then a couple of years later, they tore this one down. We also had a large YMCA building that was where the city parking lot is now, across from the Rumpus Beer Company on First Street East. It had a fully equipped gymnasium, a bowling alley, and an indoor swimming pool. It was later taken over by the Kinsman Club, and they ran it as the Civic Center until our current community center was built in 1979. And they had lots of sports teams there. I like to show this picture because it's kind of an original cut and paste. He didn't make it for picture day, but they had another picture of it, and they actually pasted him into the team picture there. And this trophy, this plaque that they're showing, it's a C.F. Lindmark trophy named after the mayor of the time. And we actually have that trophy in our museum collection here. This is one of many teams they had there. They had lacrosse teams, volleyball when volleyball was in its infancy, and baseball, and a lot of the other teams as well. And Revelstoke had hockey teams, including a women's hockey team. And there were several hockey teams in British Columbia, women's teams, and they would travel by train and have little tournaments with each other. But hockey was a much gentler sport back then. There wasn't the checking and physical contact that there is now. And Revelstoke also had a bicycle club in 1899. And they were all encouraged to meet up one day for their pictures. This was taken by a well-known BC photographer named R.H. Truman. And so even the women were riding their bikes too, but of course with their skirts on. And there's even a little sort of a tricycle contraption that the little girl is in. And the river used to freeze over. This is just north of the railway bridge. So it'd be close to sort of in between the railway bridge and what's now the Trans-Canada Highway Bridge. And at least parts of it would freeze over. They actually did ice harvesting on the river as well. The first informal ski club was started in 1891. They first started really seeing people using skis in 1890. Some of the miners in the area, Norwegian miners, would ski into town. They actually called them Norwegian snowshoes initially. And then they took the locals took up the sport. And they were mostly doing long distance runs with a little bit of slope skiing as well. But they would go like long distances on their skis. And it wasn't until 1914 that the Formal club was formed, and it became a competitive club. By then, there were quite a few families that had moved here from Sweden and Norway, and they wanted to practice their Norwegian sport of ski jumping. And they had their first ski jump in 1915. And then the next year, they made arrangements with Parks Canada to build the jump within the boundaries of Mount Revelstoke National Park, which had just been formed as a park in 1914. So their first jump on Mount Revelstoke was in 1916 and continued there until the 1970s. This is Nels Nelson, who in 1916 was the Canadian ski champion. He went on to become the world champion and held that record for many years. And they also had distance races. This is a 7-mile race. Nels Nelson is 1A in this one. And this is a great picture. We like to show this one because the woman is wearing high heel boots on her skis. And everybody skied. You know, there was a newspaper a New York magazine article from the 1920s that said from cradle to skis, that every baby, as soon as they were out of the cradle. They had them, they were on skis and on the slopes. They also did a sport called Skijoring. And this picture, I'm pretty sure that the person on the left-hand side behind the horse is Isabel Corsier, who at the time was which, and I think that dates the photograph to actually 1922, but she was just turning 16. And she also that year became the women's ski jumping champion, because really was the only woman that was jumping. And she participated in this rather dangerous sport of skijoring as well. Another jumping photo from the 1920s. They had the judges' towers built there. There's been a couple of different towers over the years, but the latest tower is still up on Mount Revelstoke. It's that national parks have done a really good job of interpreting the ski jumping history there. It's well worth a trip up there. And then in the 1950s, the club started putting on events called Tournament of Champions, and they were inviting jumpers from all over the world to come. So for years, up until the late 60s, early 70s, they had the international competitions on Mount Revelstoke. And I'd like to show this one, because if I do this presentation to some of the Australians who are here working, this is one of the first Australians that we know of that was here skiing. There was Australian Air Force doing training in Calgary, and they brought some of the men here for holidays in 1943, and of course they took them up and taught them how to ski. They nicknamed this guy Snowy because of how often he fell down. They also was a downhill run built on the east side of slope of Mount Revelstoke. And then they had Heather Lodge, which was local people had the ski lodge built at the summit of Mount Revelstoke from 1939 until it was taken down by parks in the late 1960s. And the skiers would climb up the mountain and then ski at the summit and then ski down. Saw one note where my father-in-law, Jim English, at one point had the record of skiing down in, I think, 25 seconds or 25 minutes, and that it was later beat by members of the McRae family who are really active in the local ski scene. They beat him by a couple of minutes. These are some skiers at the summit of Mount Revelstoke in 1941. We used that photograph on the cover of our book that we have available in the museum called First Tracks. And there's women there as well. My husband's aunt is one of the skiers in that photograph. And there's pictures of some of the crowds that would gather for the Tournament of Champions events. And Mount Mckenzie Ski Hill opened in 1963, while there were still active skiing on Mount Revelstoke as well. But within a few years, most of the skiing operations had moved there. They only had runs at the lower slopes of the mountain until later on they were able to do cat skiing and bring people to the upper slopes until finally the hill was purchased, and they developed the gondolas to the top and opened up more runs, and now have the longest vertical in North America. So this is us here at the museum. Our building was built in 1926 as a post office and customs, and we've been the museum since 1974. And we've featured quite a few exhibits on the Sinixt First Nation, a lot of the history of Revelstoke, Land of Thundering Snow exhibit. And we do have a lot of material online as well. So encourage people to dig into the history. This is our Stories Beneath the Surface exhibit about the communities that were lost due to the flooding from the dam reservoir. And there's the exhibit on Manning's Candy Store and C.B. Hume. And we opened an exhibit a couple of years ago about the history of Mount Revelstoke National Park. So there's lots to explore in the museum. We encourage people to come in. This particular week, this Friday, November 27th, I believe, is called Moonlight Madness in Revelstoke. So it's a shopping day when most of the stores have discounts and they're open late in the evening. And we're open on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And we've got free admission this week as well. So it's a great time to come in and explore the museum. We've got a great gift shop with some of products featuring some of things from our own collection, some posters and vintage t-shirts and crests and pins. And a lot of our photograph collection is available for purchase as well. And we have a few publications that we have. First Tracks, A History of Skiing in Revelstoke, and a couple of books that I've written on early history of Revelstoke based on my brown bag history talks, Revelstoke Origins and Creating a Community. And we now have an online store. So if you go on to our website, revelstokemuseum.ca, you can find more there. So I apologize for throwing in a bit of advertising here with the talk. I encourage people to contact me if you have any questions, and hope to see you at the museum. Thanks for joining us today.